described as unknown or unidentified. Especially from 1969 to 1973, the bombing killed more Cambodian civilians than insurgent troops, possibly 150,000 civilians in all. Peasant youth joined the Khmer Rouge in outrage at the bombing, and the Khmer Rouge forces grew from about 5,000 or less in 1969 to over 200,000 troops and militia in 1973. They took power in 1975. Pol Pot and the other Khmer Rouge leaders envisioned an agrarian society free of urban contaminations. When they took Phnom Penh in April 1975, they immediately evacuated its 2 million residents into the countryside, blew up the National Bank, abolished money, and launched attacks into communist Vietnam and later Thailand and Laos, attacking all three of their neighbouring countries. 4 years later, 1.7 million Cambodians had died, a fifth of the population. Meanwhile, in 1976, the Khmer Rouge had turned a Phnom Penh high school into S21, their secret central prison and extermination centre. There, they photographed 4,000 prisoners and killed 14,000. Only 7 survived in 1979, when the regime fell to a Vietnamese invasion. Another prisoner of the Khmer Rouge. And here's what happened to most of the 14,000 prisoners. I visited this site as it was being excavated in 1980. It is now a memorial with skulls stored behind glass walls in a Buddhist stupa. These two memorials are in Vietnam. They're memorials to the Vietnamese village people who were killed in Khmer Rouge cross-border attacks. In the same year that the Cambodian genocide began, in 1975, Indonesia's military dictatorship invaded the small territory of East Timor. These photos were taken just beforehand. About the same percentage of East Timorese perished at Indonesia's hands, over 20%, as Cambodians died at the hands of the Khmer Rouge. But Indonesia stayed in power in East Timor 20 years longer, until 1999. And they never wiped out the local resistance forces of East Timorese. And when Indonesian forces finally left the country under UN occupation in 1999, the Indonesian forces burned down 80% of the buildings in the country. This is a satellite image taken over East Timor a week after the 1999 UN referendum, in which 79% of East Timorese voted for independence from Indonesia. The capital, Dili, is on the north coast, just there. And I'm going to zoom in to that area, and you can see the black plumes of smoke here, which are the fires set by the Indonesian troops as they left the city, and the red splotches, red splotches here all over the city are fires burning as the Indonesians left. Meanwhile, in the 1980s, another military dictatorship in Guatemala conducted a counterinsurgency genocide of Mayan Indian groups. In an age-old theme, the Guatemalan regime urged survivors to become new farmers. The red splotches on this satellite image, taken at the time, indicate areas subjected to scorched earth military tactics in order to destroy the ethnic Maya Ixil inhabitants who were found by the Truth Commission in Guatemala much later to have been victims of genocide. The 1994 Rwandan genocide of the Tutsi minority was possible in part because Tutsis could be identified by their ID cards which mentioned their Tutsi ethnicity. The genocide came complete with its own cult of antiquity. The year before it began, one of the perpetrators, Ferdinand Nahimana, published this map of former kingdoms of North and Northwest Rwanda, which he wanted to re-establish by exterminating the Tutsi minority. Here he is on the left in court. He's now serving a life sentence for genocide. Here is a post-genocide satellite image of Rwanda. The blue circles represent mass graves from the 1994 genocide. The red circles represent memorials established for the victims, and the green, in this area, the green circles represent areas where resistance occurred to the genocide. The two green circles over there represent Bisesero and Karongi on this map, which was where Tutsi Muslims held out in resistance to the genocidal regime. This satellite image shows red splotches where deforestation took place as the regime destroyed the forest to track down the resistance led by Tutsis fighting for their lives. A close-up shows just how much was red, that is, the vegetation was destroyed as the regime closed in on the Tutsi survivors. Here is an image of, satellite image of the outbreak of genocide in Darfur in 2003 and 4. The next one shows the immediate impact of the genocide on the environment. As you can see, the relatively less vegetation is coded blue, and those blue splotches represent a decrease in vegetation. As a result of the genocide having commenced, the population has been killed or driven away, and the crops are not being planted a year after the genocide commenced. But the longer term impact is shown in the next image. 3 or 4 years later, a massive rebounding of the biomass as the vegetation grows back in 3 or 4 years, because not only are the people gone, but their grazing stock, sheep, goats and camels, have also been killed or driven away and stolen by the perpetrators. In ancient times, and certainly since at least the 15th century, 4 telltale characteristics in the thinking of genocide perpetrators have recurred regularly: the preoccupations with race, antiquity, agriculture, and expansion. The early modern rediscovery of Rome's destruction of Carthage provoked repeated comparisons with indigenous victims of contemporary cases. In colonial Ireland and colonial Mexico, commentators speculated that the hapless indigenous people were descended from dispersed Carthaginian survivors. A British official making policy in the Scottish Highlands in 1692 wrote of the MacDonald clan, delenda est Carthago. As expansionism escalated, the myth of an untouched, empty land usually played a key role in spurring the displacement and destruction of its actual inhabitants. So did the settler fetish for cultivation of that land. Agricultural metaphors easily expressed mass murder of target groups. A Spanish judge in 16th century Mexico referred to using Indian blood to irrigate the fields. It's not clear that he was supporting that idea. He may have been condemning it, but he referred to it happening. While British and German settlers in Australia threatened to use the bodies of Aborigines for fertilizer. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia did do that. They used the victims' bodies for fertilizer. Even as urbanisation spread over the globe in the 20th century, a violent form of agrarianism still flourished through the final decades. From Eastern Europe to Southeast Asia, from Central America and Central Africa, genocidal regimes across the political spectrum that massacred ethnic enemies also sponsored agriculturalists and settlers, employing the same terms in a variety of vocabularies. The Nazis in 1943, the Khmer Rouge in 1976, the Indonesian military in East Timor in 1980, the Guatemalan dictatorship in 1983, and Rwanda's Hutu regime in the 1990s all coined their own words for model farmers. Fetishes of biological purity and contamination have also strengthened the racism and violence that promote genocide. In Ireland in 1580, Lord Arthur Grey de Wilton informed Queen Elizabeth that Catholicism was a disease, a canker never receiving cure without corrosive medicines. In 1641, another English commander, Sir Charles Coote, justified his order to kill not only Irish men and women, but also children more than a span long, with the metaphor, "Kill the nits and you will have no lice." In the 19th century, this slogan re-emerged in both the Australian outback and the American West as a common call to massacre Indians and Aborigines. Quote, "Nits grow into lice." The Nazis too likened Jews to lice, while Al-Qaeda and Daesh today target Iraq's Shia and Yazidi communities as the locus where the disease lies. The cure and prevention of the crime of genocide must lie, at least in part, in the diagnosis of its recurring causes and symptoms. Despite all these catastrophes, the 16th century Portuguese Jesuit was wrong. All was not homicide, at or since the beginning of the world, not even in the early modern and modern world. Large historical processes have made genocide more likely, but it is always a result of decisions made by individuals, usually very few, who think in certain similar ways, discuss them with each other, and set about putting those views into action. Genocide is not inherent in human history, but it is recognizable there. Often it is detectable in advance. It can be seen coming. We have to recognize it. I'd like to conclude with some suggestions, very tentative suggestions, for how perhaps the history of genocide and the study of genocide can help maybe to understand the history of the Franco regime in Spain. There has been some good work done by Antonio Miguez and others on the concept of war crimes as applicable to the repression and killings by the Franco regime. And the point I would like to add to that, as well as on the question of crimes against humanity, I would like to take up the specific question of one particular crime against humanity, which I believe has not been given enough attention in the truth commissions and the legal discussions of mass atrocities and transitional justice. I mentioned the case of East Timor. There was a very successful truth commission as a result of the Indonesian crimes committed in East Timor. It was largely funded by Japan, and it was carried out in a very professional manner. And it reported in 2006, and the conclusion of the Truth Commission for East Timor was that Indonesia had committed extermination as a crime against humanity. The death toll they estimated as between 100 and 150,000 out of a population of about 600 to 650,000 at the time of the Indonesian invasion in 1975. So this was a large, as I mentioned, 20% of the population possibly had been exterminated. They didn't broach the question of genocide, even though I think myself that minority groups, particularly ethnic Chinese in East Timor, were targeted by the Indonesian forces and may have been, there may have been a case of genocide there. But they took the case of the question of extermination because it's much more clear-cut. Extermination as a crime against humanity does not require proof of the intent to destroy a group as such. It requires only proof of an attack on a population that is widespread or systematic. It can happen in war or in peace. The motive of that attack is irrelevant, and it must be an attack on an identifiable group, but it does not have to be an ethnic, national, racial, or religious group. And so the Truth Commission made the case, I think, unequivocally, a clear and strong case that Indonesia had committed extermination as a crime against humanity against the population of East Timor, or a part of the population of East Timor. And I think that is a precedent which could be used in many other cases. There are plenty of cases where genocide may have been committed, but the lawyers won't take it up. Historians can see a case that might be arguable, but the lawyers are afraid to take up a case in case it might be lost in a court. And I'll give another example of that, which was in the Cambodian case, where it was quite clear, the case is still proceeding in the Cambodian extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia right now, which is supported by the United Nations. The case is proceeding for genocide against the ethnic Vietnamese in Cambodia, minority group, and the ethnic Muslim Cham, both of whom I mentioned. But there is a very strong case against another element of the population, a geographic or political group from the eastern part of the country. And doing my research on the Pol Pot period, became very clear very quickly that people from the east of Cambodia, although they were from the majority Khmer ethnic group, they were targeted to be exterminated almost completely. And they were even marked by having to wear a specific scarf, and they were deported from the east of the country. And I concluded from interviewing hundreds of people that probably 250,000 and at least 100,000 of them were killed in 6 months, principally because they were from the east of the country. And it was largely because of the leadership of that eastern part of the country that was mistrusted by the Pol Pot regime. So clearly they were targeted as a political group, and they were from a geographic part of the country, and they were therefore not seen by the lawyers as belonging to an ethnic, national, racial or religious group, and therefore were not seen as an easy case of genocide. Even though the Genocide Convention looked at, does include part of a national group. And it seemed to me that it would be quite clearly arguable that they could be seen as victims of genocide against part of a national group. But the lawyer's view was, well, we have 2 clear cases of genocide against the ethnic Vietnamese and the Cham, and they wouldn't take the case of the Eastern Zone group. But they could have pursued it as an extermination against, as a crime against humanity. But that hasn't been the way it has panned out in the case in Cambodia. But I imagine that there may be a case worth pursuing by Spanish historians and lawyers, not necessarily a legal case, but pursuing the argument that what happened could be considered extermination in the case of the Spanish repression. However, there's also a case in the Indonesian history of the mass murder of the communists and suspected communists in Indonesia in 1965, in which 500,000 or more were killed. And I'd like to move here from the conceptual to the comparative suggestions for possible research. In the Indonesian case, most of the people targeted for killing in a 6-month period, 500,000 people were killed. They were killed as supposed communists, but also they were killed as supposed atheists. And a very talented Australian PhD was written, PhD candidate, finished her dissertation on this, Jessica Melvin. She's now working on this to turn it into a book at Yale University. And she has obtained the first documents from the Indonesian military about the targeting of people in Indonesia. And she has put together a case by investigating genocide of a religious group. This might not seem to make too much sense, but apparently as a legal case, atheists or non-believers in Islam, in this case, were targeted because they didn't believe in Islam or were accused of not believing in Islam. Most of the communists did actually believe in Islam, but they were also communists. And they were targeted by that accusation of being atheists. And that, according to some arguments, qualifies them as a religious group under the Genocide Convention. So it may be worth looking in the Spanish case of people who were targeted as non-Catholics or anti-Catholics or atheists, specifically for their religious or non-religious or anti-religious beliefs, whether that would qualify as a campaign against a religious or anti-religious group. I think also the argument could be made, or the understanding could be deepened of this Franco regime by looking at the cases that have built up in so many different theatres where genocide has taken place, that there is so much linkage between domestic genocide within a country and territorial expansionism outside that country. The same regime often engages in expansionism and domestic mass murder. And I wonder whether much attention has been given. I just don't know about the historiography of this, but it seems to me that in the case of Mussolini's regime and the pre-Mussolini regime, so a very good argument has been made by a Libyan scholar that Italy's invasion of Libya before Mussolini's regime, but leading up to it, comprised genocide. And I don't know enough about the Spanish conquest of Morocco or what Franco was doing and the Spanish military were doing in Morocco, but whether that any repression that took place there might have desensitized the Spanish military and led up to a more violent repression within Spain or not. It might be worth looking at it. But whatever the case, I think in terms of future research, in all of these specific angles or avenues of research, accuracy is the most important thing to aim for. It's really important to try to be as careful and accurate as possible. I'd like to end with one rather different suggestion for comparative research. It's only occurred to me in the last couple of days of listening to the conference. This is the former president of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, who was a former Confucian Mandarin. He was president of South Vietnam from 1955 to his assassination in 1973. And he was previously, that's him second from the right, His brother was one of the first Vietnamese archbishops, and another brother was one of his very close advisors who studied in France in the 1930s. He became prime minister and then president, and then he and his brother were both assassinated in 1973. He, in some ways, suggested to me an interesting comparison, maybe a contrast as well, with the Franco regime, the first republic of South Vietnam. He's usually described as a very traditional Vietnamese figure, as you see from here, and from here on the right, Ngo Dinh Diem again. But actually, he was, in fact, a very modern European-style political politician. Ngo Dinh Diem was strongly nationalistic, very nationalistic. He was also staunchly and strongly Catholic. He was also staunchly and strongly anti-communist. And he was also staunchly and strongly anti-democratic. His problem was that only about 10% of South Vietnam was Catholic, and the rest of the population were Buddhist or of other religions, and he never managed to really establish himself in a strong position. But the ideology, particularly from his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, who lived in France in the 1930s, was strongly influenced by Emmanuel Mounier and the idea of personalism of the French Catholic centre-left in particular, and the idea of personalism as an answer to the materialism of both liberalism and communism. And he brought that back to Vietnam, and both of the Ngo brothers, the president and his rather secretive advisor, made personalism the official ideology of South Vietnam, as well as Catholicism. Ngo Dinh Diem dedicated South Vietnam to the Virgin Mary, which didn't make him very popular with the Buddhist majority. And eventually it was the Buddhist crisis and his discrimination against Buddhists, or his regime's discrimination against Buddhists, which brought him down in a military coup, and he and his brother were both assassinated. But that, I think the misunderstanding of him as a traditional politician, he was really, at least to some extent, a modern European modern European political person of the Franco-Mussolini style, and I think there might be some benefit in making a comparison between a Southeast Asian politician of that ilk and a European politician of that ilk. Muchas gracias.
Para, 5 minutos para alguna pregunta, porque a las 8:30 hay que hacer la clausura, así que si hay alguna pregunta, por favor, estamos a su disposición.
La hago en inglés, en español, la hago en inglés, la traduzco al español. Okay, I'm going to ask the question in English first, and then I'm going to try to translate it into Spanish quickly. My question, I don't know whether you have studied the memorials related to genocide. So I have a question related to that, and then 2 small questions or curiosities. The question is, when did those memorials begin to be erected? And the second question, or the 2 small questions, are: first one, the Irish memorial, when was that built? Was there a political purpose related to England? And then the Hideyoshi's mound is astonishing that it has lasted for several centuries. But what surprised me was that the sculpture that was topping it is a Buddhist symbol, which is equivalent to the cross in Catholic graveyards. So I wonder when that image, when that sculpture was placed there, because it totally changes the meaning of the mound, in my opinion. So rápidamente le pregunté si había estudiado, no el genocidio, que obviamente lo ha estudiado, sino los memoriales, los monumentos relacionados con el homicidio. Entonces la primera pregunta es ¿cuándo empezaron a aparecer estos memoriales? La segunda pregunta es en relación con el memorial irlandés que nos mostró cuándo fue erigido y también si tuvo un propósito político, sobre todo en relación con Inglaterra. Y la última pregunta es el montículo que nos mostró de Japón, que fue erigido por el emperador Hideyoshi hace varios siglos, con las narices, creo, de los coreanos que habían exterminado. Y ese monumento, en algún momento histórico posterior, probablemente muy recientemente, le colocaron encima una escultura que tiene 5 niveles, que son niveles de menor a mayor espiritualidad. Esa escultura es el equivalente en el budismo a lo que es la cruz en los cementerios católicos. Entonces la pregunta es ¿cuándo fue colocado esa escultura? ¿Quién la colocó? ¿Con qué propósito? Porque obviamente la colocación de esa escultura cambia por completo el significado original que Hideyoshi le quiso dar al montículo, que era un montículo de victoria, digamos.
Thank you for those questions. I'm pretty sure that the Irish memorial to the 1580 massacre of the Spanish and papal troops was erected in the last 6 or 8 years. The Vietnamese memorials to the victims of the Cambodian cross-border attacks are older than that, I think probably 20 to 25 years old. The Mimizuka in Kyoto, the ear mound, it's interesting, this invasion of Korea by Hideyoshi's forces included both Buddhist and Christian Japanese forces. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some resemblance of that participation. Some of the Buddhist clergy were, and one or two of the Buddhist monasteries in Japan were specialist arms manufacturers at that time, and there were Christian monasteries in the south of Japan near Nagasaki which were also very militarized, and it was not until the 1600s that Christianity came to be persecuted in Japan. So they both took part, and there are quite horrifying accounts of Buddhist monks either glorifying or sometimes regretting the violence that they participated in Korea.
Una pregunta más, solo nos da tiempo una más, sí.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was amazing to be here with such an expert with this big vision of the history of the genocide. My question is very simple in a way. It relates to the idea of a global organization of genocide in connection with that term named necropolitics, right, by Mbe and other theorists of politics now. So do you think if there is such a thing as a global organization of genocide now in connection with neoliberalism, capital history? I mean, if there is a specific connection of genocide and today's global formation of economics?
Could you just repeat the term? I didn't.
Yeah, necropolitics.
Necropolitics. I'm not familiar with that at all.
What was the idea?
I'd be learning from you if you could tell me a bit more about it. If you could describe.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry. It's just the idea that there are certain countries, certain areas in the planet in which genocide is not possible by legal organization and other things. And at the same time, in other territories, genocide is getting more and more common, and also more and more visible.
Yeah, that's a quite thoughtful interpretation, but I'd have to think more about it. You know, obviously, it's from a legal point of view, the increasing prosecution of cases of genocide is, I think, only likely to be deterring more cases than not, but it's very difficult to measure the deterrence effect on potential genocide perpetrators. But certainly, given the record of the first 50 years of the Genocide Convention, which came into force in 1950, the convention was passed in 1948, and it was not until 1998 that anybody was convicted of genocide in an international forum, and that was one of the Rwandan perpetrators. But since then, a fairly substantial number of cases in a fairly substantial number of theatres in the world, people have been convicted of genocide, and that must be having some effect on potential genocide perpetrators, but how we would measure that, I've got no idea. On the other hand, the long-term historical and social forces that allow genocide perpetrators to recruit followers and to come to power, or at least to practice, to engage in genocidal practices, I think are probably getting worse, although at the level of global poverty that might be decreasing, but in terms of climate change and global warming and global inequality, we are looking at forces that can only feed into the recruiting ability of potential genocide perpetrators, including the arms trade and the availability of weaponry of mass destruction that I think cannot be considered optimistic prognosis for the future. I don't know if that answers your question.
Muy bien. Tenemos que terminar porque es la hora que nos han marcado. Muchísimas gracias al profesor Kiernan. Creo que debemos despedirle con un fuerte aplauso. Muchas gracias. Bueno, ahora se hará el acto de clausura, así que nos levantaremos de la mesa y les damos la bendición. Gracias.
Bueno, moi boa tarde a todos e a todas, moi boas noites case. Queremos proceder protocolariamente, pero non só ao acto de clausura. Este encontro, coloquio, curso tuvo unha inauguración. Rematámoslo cunha conferencia magnífica que, bueno, justamente por o axusto de tempos non puido dar lugar a un debate máis amplio. Entre outras razóns, porque era a conferencia final, porque era como unha especie de traca final, ¿no? Levamos 3 días discutindo un asunto delicado que ten que ver justamente con esta imaxe do congreso, ¿no? De non naturalizar que o alcalde da Coruña, o general de brigada, o o general de división, a muller do gobernador civil e o gobernador civil foran fusilados como consecuencia dun golpe de Estado. Esta imaxe sempre é interpretada en algo referido ao golpe e á guerra como a imaxe dos perpetradores, e aquí estaba o engado e o engano, é a imaxe das víctimas. Isto nos leva a reflexionar moito, levamos 3 días reflexionando, chegamos a algunhas conclusións. Non queremos facer un novo relato, senón moitos relatos. Non queremos facer unha conclusión, senón moitas conclusións. E en todo caso queremos quedarnos co que o profesor Kiernan acaba de plantexarnos e as propias ideas que ele indica que podemos desenvolver, e moitas outras. O que queremos, en todo caso, é darlle continuidade a isto, felicitarnos porque creo que todo o mundo, en fin, fomos falando, non somos tantos, casi todos temos a sensación de que rompemos barreiras non solamente do conocemento, os límites autoimpostos, sino tamén barreiras entre unhas disciplinas e outras, entre uns continentes e outros, entre Timor-Leste, Australia, Galicia, Argentina, Finlandia, e que isto nos axuda a entender mellor un pasado que non somos nós, que non ten que ver con nós, aínda que ten moito que ver con nós. Ten que ver cos nosos devanceiros e, sobre todo, ten que ver con algo fundamental que é a humanidade. E, nese sentido, queremos, en fin, a mí me gustaría que, aínda que les dicen que non, os meus compañeiros digan algo. Nos acompaña Valentín González Formoso, que é o presidente da Diputación, e que fai o galano de vir hoxe aquí para contribuir a clausurar este acto, pero tamén porque para nós foi moi importante que as institucións que son a Universidade, que é a Consellería de Educación da Xunta de Galicia, que é o Concello de Santiago, que apoiou muitísimo este congreso, como xa dixemos na súa inauguración, e tamén a Diputación, que en última instancia, no último momento, a presidencia da Diputación botou unha man cando lla pedimos, porque era necesario e porque nos facía falta esa man, e hoxe está aquí precisamente o presidente da Diputación, creo que para representar, como no caso da inauguración, algo que é importante, e é que a parte dos cidadáns, a parte da sociedade civil, a parte dos académicos e das académicas, pois hai institucións que entenden, e temos que reconocer que é unha sorte, porque isto significa que no futuro poderemos seguir facendo cousas, ¿no? Que entenden e apoian, digamos, estas iniciativas. E antes de darlle, en fin, antes de que o presidente da Diputación diga o que queira decir, porque aquí somos todos moi libres, intentamos, pues me gustaría que Antonio Míguez ou e máis Dolores Vilavedra xeran algo, o que queiran.
Nada, moi brevemente, por suposto, transmitir o noso agradecemento pola vosa participación e porque realmente os protagonistas deste congreso e destes debates pois son a xente que está aquí con nós e algúns que xa non están, non? Solamente 2 ideas. Unha que creo que quedou claro dende o principio ata o final, que xa quizá repetimos, nós non queríamos facer outro congreso máis sobre a Guerra Civil, queríamos que este congreso fose diferente, non por un afán de diferenciarnos, sino porque creíamos que era coherente para esta idea de dar resposta á pregunta, non? Que ten este congreso no seu título, esta idea de un novo relato. Por iso pensamos que tamén na formulación das sesións, na escolla mesmo das persoas que tiñan que falar, pois esa perspectiva tamén tiña que ser algo diferente. Creo que atreverse, como xa dixen no seu momento, e repito agora tamén, atreverse a equivocarse non está mal, hai que facelo máis a menudo, e seguramente nos equivocamos en algunhas cousas. Pero, en todo caso, o resultado, para min, polo menos, e isto xa falo a un título persoal, pois ten sido moi satisfactorio, e todos os que algunha vez tivechedes a oportunidade de participar nun seminario e mesmo organizalo e poñelo en marcha, pois seguramente que o mellor que se pode dicir é que un realmente se atope no seminario ou no congreso que querría que fose, non? E nese sentido, pois nada máis, agradecervos a todos, agradecer, quero reiterar tamén o agradecemento ás institucións que nos apoiaron, porque para nós efectivamente era moi importante. Nos queríamos situar isto, xa o dixemos tamén, non fora do que era as institucións, non fora do centro, sino situarlo precisamente no centro dos debates. Nada máis, moitas gracias.
Ben, a min tócame a parte máis agradable que darvos as grazas a todas as persoas que participastes activamente nas mesas como relatores, ponentes, retrucantes, por algo que foi para nós moi importante, que nos ademais xeraba moita tensión, que é o respeto quase escrupuloso que tivestes polos tempos brevísimos, en algúns casos, asignados. Iso foi o que permitiu o diálogo e o debate, iso foi en última instancia o que permitiu que este congreso fose o máis semellante ao que nos queríamos que fose o debate, o congreso, un foro de reflexión e de diálogo. Grazas tamén aos estudantes, as persoas que viñestes a aprender. Eu teño esa intuición que algúns non falastes moito, quizáis porque vos sentistes un pouco abrumados, pero a mí me gustaba porque sempre que estaba deste lado da mesa había pues, caras de atención, caras de concentración. En última instancia, vos sodes os que lle dades sentido o noso traballo docente, polo menos. Estamos moi satisfeitos da vosa presenza e da vosa participación. Eu só quería rematar congratulándome de que o peche deste congreso fose esta conferencia, porque representa na praxe o que nós queríamos facer no plano máis teórico, máis abstracto. Representa a necesidade permanente de repensar os termos, de repensar os conceptos, as palabras, para dotalos de pleno significado no devalar do tempo histórico, e representa tamén algo do que estamos plenamente convencidos, que é a cuestión da violencia exercida de forma indiscriminada e por motivos que teñen que ver co ideolóxico, co racial, co religioso e demais, é unha cuestión de dereitos humanos, polo tanto é unha cuestión de alguna maneira transnacional e transhistórica, que é algo do que nós tamén estábamos plenamente convencidos cando nos puxemos con este desafío de repensarmos en conxunto o golpe de Estado 36, a guerra e o franquismo. Grazas, polo tanto, a todos e a todas.
Bueno, pues moi boas tardes a todas e a todos. Moi brevemente tamén agradecer sobre todo a Lorenzo Fernández e ao seu grupo de investigadores de Instagram pois a oportunidade, por unha parte a oportunidade de pechar este acto, pero sobre todo por asumir unha responsabilidade que calquera que teña un mínimo interés por a historia será consciente de que é unha responsabilidade enorme, que é incorporar a ese revisionismo positivo, a esa análisis historiográfica dos tempos pasados donde nos xogamos moito. Creo que calquera que se interese por ese período que é obxecto de reflexión nestas xornadas dase conta do drama que foi social, familiar, que truncou un proxecto de país, que nos converteu en un país distinto, con certos lastres que todavía sufrimos, con un desenganche nas políticas activas de dereitos e liberdades, con un réxime que implantaba cousas tan novedosas naquela época, como unha lei de divorcio, como un sufraxio universal, incluso no económico nos fixo paralizar 40 anos as nosas perspectivas, coa paralización das reformas agrarias, co desenganxe tecnolóxico que tuvemos fruto dese período autárquico, tivo consecuencias e nos converteu en un país moi distinto. Pero en calquer caso, a flor da democracia require ser regada e require ser cuidada, e por tanto este grupo de investigación o que está facendo é cuidala, está incorporando a darlle valor a esa xente nova que chega á universidade, se incorporan estes estudios e se incorporan a posibilidade de analizar por que ocorreu aquilo, cales foron as claves, desde a obxectividade máis absoluta, pero que nos permita valorar o que temos, o noso sistema democrático con todos os fallos que ten, que en calquer caso sempre está en perigo se non somos capaces de facer ese análisis, como digo, histórico.